All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how it is you want to get smart fast? So whether you're prepping for some big debate, trying to catch up on a new field, or just, super curious, we're here to hook you up with those essential insights. And today,
We're going deep on stereotype threat. And we're not just talking about how it messes with test scores, we're going way beyond that.
yeah, absolutely, we're diving into this seriously insightful research from the Educational Psychology Review, specifically an article called Stereotypes and the Achievement Gap. Stereotype Threat Prior to Test Taking by Marcus Appel and Nicole Krumberger. And what's really fascinating is that it argues stereotype threat, that's that extra weight people feel when they belong to groups facing negative stereotypes.
Right.
Right? It doesn't just hit them when they're being tested. It actually messes with their ability to learn and grow their skills right from the get-go.
So stereotype threat doesn't just affect performance, but learning too.
You got it. Okay, so I guess first, we got to make sure we're all on the same page about stereotypes in general. I mean, we all kind of know what they are, right? Like those beliefs about certain groups of people. And those beliefs often include, well, assumptions about their abilities, or sometimes more like lack of abilities in certain areas. And sadly, these stereotypes can be, seriously negative and stick around for way too long. Like you still hear that old, totally wrong idea that some groups just aren't as smart, or that women just aren't naturally good at science and tech. Ugh.
Exactly. Those kinds of things. Now, stereotype threat, that's that feeling, that anxiety, that discomfort, that hits when someone from a group facing those negative stereotypes finds themselves in a situation where, well, their abilities are being judged. It's like this added layer of worry, this fear that, oh man, what if I do badly? What if I just prove that stereotype right?
Right, right. And this all ties into that idea of social identity threat, right? But we're zeroing in on just stereotype threat today, right?
Exactly. So social identity threat, that's the bigger umbrella. It comes up whenever anyone feels like, their social group is being treated negatively or like they have a lower standing in society. Think discrimination, prejudice, all that. But stereotype threat, it's like a specific type of social identity threat. It's laser focused on those negative stereotypes that are all about performance. Can you do this? Can you not do this? So yeah, for our deep dive here, we're sticking with stereotype threat in that more focused way, looking at how that fear of confirming negative stereotypes, those you can't do this stereotypes, how that really messes with people.
Okay, I'm with you. So where did this whole understanding of stereotype threat even come from? What were those aha moments?
Well, it really kicked off with some big deal studies. Think back to Steele and Aronson, 1995. Groundbreaking stuff. They had African American and white students all taking the same test. But they presented it in two totally different ways. To one group, they said, hey, this test is going to tell us how smart you are. Basically, a test to diagnose intelligence. But to the other group, they're like, nah, it's just a problem-solving exercise, nothing to do with how smart you are.
I'm seeing where this is going, what they find.
It was wild. When they told them it was a test of how smart they were, that diagnostic condition, the African-American students, they did way worse than their white peers. But when they presented that exact same test as just a non-diagnostic task, boom, the African-American students scored just as well as the white students. And this was after they took into account everyone's overall aptitude levels. Really shows how just the way you frame something, how you trigger that fear of, what if I confirm this bad stereotype, that can totally tank performance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And wasn't there something similar with women and math?
Oh, totally. In '99, Spencer and his crew, they did this super important research. They looked at women tackling tough math problems. And when they straight up told some of the women, hey, this test has shown no gender differences in the past, those women, they crushed it. They did way better than the women who weren't told that. It was like taking off some invisible weight. And the coolest part? This boost was even bigger for the women who were already really good at math and saw it as a big part of who they were.
So, but it's not just about race or gender, right? There are other groups affected by this, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Research has shown that stereotype threat hits a ton of groups who face those nasty stereotypes. Hispanic Americans, sometimes stereotyped as less intelligent, they can experience it. Even white men, they can underperform in math when that stereotype about Asian Americans being math whizzes is right there in their faces. Men, they can score lower on tests if you tell them it's measuring social sensitivity. I mean, it goes on and on. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, stereotypes about verbal abilities, white Americans, stereotypes about athleticism, women, even driving a car. It can pop up anywhere at any age.
So at first glance, it might seem like, oh, stereotype threat explains all the differences in achievement we see between groups. Like, end of story.
Yeah, that's super important to clear up. Early on, in the news and stuff, it might have sounded like stereotype threat was the only reason for these achievement gaps. But the research, especially those big reviews called meta-analyses, that's where researchers put together the results from a bunch of different studies, right? They tell a more complex story. These meta-analyses, like the ones by Nguyen and Ryan in 2008 and Nadler and Clark in 2011, they do show that stereotype threat is real. And it's a big factor in explaining some of those average differences we see in test scores between groups. But it's definitely not the whole story.
Right, right. It's like one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And there's been back and forth about, like, how much this stuff we see in labs actually applies to, the real world, right?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Big discussions about how much those findings from those super controlled experiments actually translate to everyday life. Like, there was that research looking at whether asking students for demographic info like race or gender before or after a test messed with their scores. And
Yeah.
those initial findings and then the follow-up analyses, they kind of pointed in different directions. And same with, those standardized tests like the SAT. There's been debate about whether stereotype threat means they consistently underestimate the real abilities of people from stereotyped groups. Some huge analyses suggest maybe, yeah. But others have issues with how those analyses were done. It's messy.
So for our listeners out there, the big takeaway is that stereotype threat. It's a real deal psychological thing with real consequences. But how big of a role it plays in every single real world situation? It's still up for debate among scientists, not a simple yes or no.
Yeah, that's the perfect segue to the core argument of the research we're looking at today. See, a lot of that early research, it was all about how stereotype threat affects how you do during a test. But this article, it's saying, hold up, the damage starts way earlier. They're arguing that stereotype threat can actually screw with your ability to even learn and build your skills in the first place, not just how you show what you know under pressure.
So it's not just about like freezing up on test day. It's about not even reaching your full learning potential before that, right?
You got it. The authors, they point out that traditionally, educational psychology research on stereotype threat has been super focused on that test-taking moment. They looked at all those top journals, and there were way fewer articles about how stereotype threat impacts learning and prepping compared to, social psychology, where it's all about that immediate performance.
Interesting. So this research review is kind of like, hey, let's zoom out. Let's see how stereotype threat affects people before they even sit down for that test.
Exactly. And to get this bigger picture, they propose a 3-stage model for how stereotype threat goes down.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But before we get into those stages, can we break down how stereotype threat even works its magic? Like, what's happening in our brains?
So this model by Schmeder and her team in 2008, it's really helpful. They say stereotype threat creates this mental tug of war inside you. It pops up when, you see yourself as part of a certain social group, and that group's connected to some ability that matters to you. But here's the catch, your group's also hit with a negative stereotype in that exact area.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like one part of you is like, I'm a problem solver. But then there's this other voice like, but people like you aren't good at that. Ugh, talk about an inner battle.
It is. It's a total cognitive imbalance. And it gets even worse, if you really identify strongly with that group and if that skill or area is super important to you. And if you're the kind of person who's always aware of social stigma, thinking, is this going to apply to me? That can really amplify the threat.
Okay, so all this inner turmoil, this mental juggling, how does it actually mess with someone's ability to learn and think clearly?
So research points to a few key things that basically drain your working memory. That's that mental space we use to process info and tackle complex stuff, right? One factor. It's good old stress, that physiological response. Now, when people are asked how stressed they feel under stereotype threat, the results are kind of mixed, but the physical stuff, like heart rate, all that, that shows more consistently that, yeah, stress levels go up when stereotype threat's activated.
What else happens in the brain that could get in the way of learning?
So cognitively, people experiencing stereotype threat, they start doing a ton of self-monitoring. They get hyper-aware of everything they do, everything around them, always looking for any little sign that, oh no, am I confirming the stereotype? Am I failing? They might even try to distance themselves mentally from the group,
Right.
or downplay how much they actually care about that skill.
Yeah.
And then instead of aiming high, they just try not to screw up. Avoidance becomes the goal. And any feedback, whether it's from someone else or just their own thoughts, they overanalyze it thinking, does this mean I'm proving the stereotype right?
Man, that sounds exhausting.
It is totally mentally draining. And then emotionally, you've got all these negative feelings, thoughts, and expectations swirling around. People might try to push them down,
Yeah.
suppress them. But even that takes mental energy. So all of this, the stress, the self-monitoring, the emotion control, it all eats away at that precious working memory.
And we all know working memory is essential for learning and problem solving, right?
Yeah.
No working memory, no learning.
Exactly. Schmatter and Johns in 2003, they showed that working memory takes a hit when stereotype threats in play, and that drop in working memory. It's been linked to worse performance on all sorts of tasks, including those tricky math tests. And this also helps explain why a stereotype threat tends to have a bigger impact on those more complex things that really tax your working memory, like creative problem solving or using knowledge in new situations.
So we're seeing how stereotype threat can mess with performance in the moment. But what about actual learning? The process of picking up new skills and knowledge. What's the evidence there?
This is where things get super interesting. There haven't been as many studies looking at learning directly compared to test performance, but what we do have, it paints a pretty clear picture. Like Rydell and his colleagues in 2010, they found that women dealing with math stereotype threat, they actually missed out on those usual patterns of perceptual learning when they were trying to learn new Chinese characters. It's like the threat messed with their brain's ability to process and absorb that new visual info.
Wow, that's subtle but huge. It's affecting how their brains are working.
Right. And then there's Appel and his team in 2011. They found that women under stereotype threat, when they were studying for a test, they took worse notes. And they weren't as good at judging the quality of other people's notes either. So stereotype threat might be messing with how people process and remember info during study time.
So it's not just about test day, it's affecting the whole learning journey.
Exactly. And then Rydell again, and Bosher in 2010, they found that women under math stereotype threat, they had more trouble grasping new math problems. And then on tests where they had to use what they learned, especially those tests where they had to apply it to new situations, they did worse. They even saw signs of less efficient implicit learning. That's the learning that happens without you even realizing it in the background.
And these aren't just fleeting effects on learning, right?
Nope. Taylor and Walton in 2011, they showed that stereotype threat can keep hurting learning over time. They found that Black American students facing stereotype threat had a harder time learning and then remembering those less common English words. So the threat could be interfering with how new info gets stored in your memory, leading to long-term gaps in knowledge.
Didn't the review mention some other studies that back up this idea of stereotype threat hitting learning?
Oh, yeah. Sekakwaptua and Thompson, back in 2002, they found that people who are the only one of their gender in a study group, they did worse on a later test, even if they weren't alone during the actual test. So just feeling like the solo representative while learning, that seemed to create a threat that made it harder to learn. And Stone's 2002 study showed that white Americans under that stereotype about athletic ability, they actually practiced less for a golf putting task when their self-worth was tied to how well they did. The threat demotivated them from even practicing.
But wasn't there some back and forth on how stereotype threat affects how long people spend learning?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. Mangels and his team in 2012, they saw that women spent about the same amount of time prepping, whether or not they were under stereotype threat. But that extra time didn't lead to better scores under high threat. However, Rydell and his crew, in a different 2010 study, they found a link between how much time women spent learning and how well they did later, even when under threat. So yeah, it's complicated. Stereotype threat and learning effort, there's a lot more to unpack there. Lots of factors at play.
Makes sense. Now, what about how people explain their failures when they're under stereotype threat? Does that mess with future learning?
Well, research, including Steele and Aronson's classic work, it suggests that under stereotype threat, people tend to blame their failures on outside stuff like, oh, I was stressed, or the task was too hard, or even they're biased against me. It's a way to protect their ego, right? But get this, Koka and his team in 2008, they found something different. Women under stereotype threat, they actually blame themselves more for failing a super hard computer task. Plus, Cohen and his team in '99, they showed that students from stereotype groups, they might not benefit as much from helpful feedback if they think it's biased because of their group. So yeah, that can really hurt their learning and improvement.
So, stereotype threat, it's not just a one-time thing on test day. It's this huge obstacle that shapes how we learn and even how we see our own potential.
Absolutely. And that brings us to how stereotype threat can mess with how we identify with certain fields and the career choices we make. Think about it. If you're constantly hit with those negative stereotypes in a certain area, you might just start to disconnect from it. It's like saying, well, if I'm not supposed to be good at this anyway, maybe it's just not for me. a way to protect yourself, but it can really limit you.
It's like self-preservation, but it can backfire, right?
Totally. Steele's work back in the 90s, it showed how this disidentification can lead to people, especially those facing stereotypes about intelligence, they might just drop out of school. And even within specific subjects, those stereotypes can steer people away. Smith and his colleagues in 2007, they found that just triggering those gender stereotypes about math made women less interested in computer programming, especially women who were really driven to achieve.
And remember those TV ads we talked about earlier? How even those can have an impact.
Oh, yeah. Davies and his team in 2002, they showed that women who saw those ads with all those traditional gender roles, they ended up preferring verbal tasks over math, compared to women who saw neutral ads, and their career dreams even shifted. They were less into those number-heavy careers after seeing those stereotypical ads. Cherian and her team in 2009, they found that even the place you're in matters. Women were less into computer science if the room is decked out with all that stereotypical geeky guy stuff.
It's crazy how these subtle things can shape how we see ourselves.
It is. And one more thing. Good and his colleagues, they found that women under math stereotype threat, they were more likely to pick easier math problems. They avoided the challenge. And that can really hurt their learning and growth in the long run.
So given how big of a deal stereotype threat is there any research on how to fight back? Like, what works?
Luckily, this is where research is really promising. We've got studies showing that even quick psychological interventions can make a real difference for students facing stereotype threat.
Okay, tell me more about these interventions. What works?
One that's super powerful is self-affirmation. Cohen and his team have done a ton of work on this. They've had students from different backgrounds, including African American and European American students, spend a few minutes writing about values that matter to them. And guess what? The African American students who did these self-affirmation exercises, their grades actually got better in the weeks and months after. Even their GPAs over time were higher. Now, here's the thing. It didn't really affect the European American students. Maybe because their self-worth wasn't as challenged in school.
Wow, that's amazing. Just writing about your values can have such a lasting impact.
It is. And Walton and Cohen, they've also found that these self-affirmation exercises can help with overall well-being, too. Happier, healthier, the whole package. There are other cool interventions, too, like helping students reframe their experiences. Walton and Cohen found that if you help Black students see those feelings of not belonging in college as just normal adjustment stuff, not about their race, they do better academically. And Aronson's team showed that emphasizing that intelligence isn't fixed, that it can grow and change, that can help buffer against stereotype threat, too.
So this all really points to the idea that stereotype threat isn't just a one-time thing. It's this ongoing process that can hit people at different points in their education.
Exactly. And the authors of that research review we've been talking about, they came up with this really helpful three-stage model. First stage, disidentification. That's where, you see those negative stereotypes and you just start to distance yourself from that whole area. Protect your self-esteem, but it can lead to lower skills and less engagement. The good news is having supportive people at school, with friends, and at home, that can really help at this stage.
Okay, makes sense. What's the next stage?
Stage 2 is stereotype threat during learning. So this is when people who do identify with a certain subject, they get hit with stereotype threat while they're learning. And that threat can mess with all those brain processes we need to learn well, like how we take in new info, how we summarize and understand complex stuff, even how we use learning strategies. So in the end, you might not learn as well, and you might not do as well on tests later on. This stage could also explain what they call the overprediction mystery. That's where some groups of students get lower grades in college than their SAT scores would predict.
Right, okay. And that last stage, the one we talked about at the beginning.
You got it. Stage 3 is stereotype threat during test taking. That's where the pressure's really on, and that negative stereotype can start people from performing at their best, even if they have the knowledge and skills. Now, whether experiencing stereotype threat earlier on, like in those first 2 stages, makes you more or less vulnerable during a test, that's complicated. Maybe it makes you more sensitive. Or maybe you've learned to cope better and you're more resilient. More research needed there.
So this 3-stage model really helps us see how stereotype threat can just keep getting in the way of achievement.
Totally. And the authors, they highlight some big things for future research, too. They say we need way more studies that specifically look at stereotype threat during learning and prep, not just test taking. And they think we can learn a ton by taking what we already know about stereotype threat during tests and applying it to those earlier learning phases. But we got to be careful because some things might work differently when you're learning versus taking a test.
So what are some of the specific things they suggest researching?
Well, they want to know how stereotype threat at different stages might be connected. Like, if you disidentify early on, does that make stereotype threat worse when you're trying to learn something? And are there feedback loops? Like, do bad experiences just make you want to disidentify even more? They also point out that stereotype threat might be happening in way more subjects and for more groups than we've studied so far, like history, political science, even
Nice.
hands-on stuff. And what about boys? Maybe they face stereotype threat in general learning based on the idea that girls are just better learners. They also brought up cognitive load theory, especially with online learning. The idea is if stereotype threat is already eating up our mental energy, then bad online learning materials that make us think too hard. Those could be extra bad for people already dealing with stereotype threat. And one more thing, they want to see how the fact that computers are seen as a guy thing might affect how women learn on computers. And could computer-based learning actually be good for students who worry about biased feedback from teachers? Lots to explore.
So much, yeah. Okay, so let's get practical. What can teachers, parents, even just people in general, what can we do to lessen the impact of stereotype threat? How do we make learning fairer and better for everyone?
The authors are big on preventing stereotype threat in the first place and giving people tools to deal with it when it does show up. For prevention, one big thing is to not make a big deal out of those social identities that have negative stereotypes attached to them, at least in that specific learning environment. Don't single people out or do things that could be seen as special treatment just because of their group. Instead, focus on what they're good at, those parts of their identity that aren't under threat. And watch out for those subtle cues in the environment that could make someone feel like they don't belong. It's huge to avoid saying or doing anything that could even accidentally reinforce those bad stereotypes or make someone feel less than because of their group. And showcasing positive role models from those stereotyped groups that can help break down those automatic negative associations.
What about how we present learning tasks and the feedback we give?
Oh, that's super important. When you're explaining a task, don't use language that triggers those stereotypes. Like, focus on problem-solving skills, not just raw intelligence. Make it clear that people from all different backgrounds can do well on this task, and emphasize that intelligence isn't set in stone, that you can get smarter through hard work and learning. That goes against those harmful ideas about some groups just being naturally better. When you're giving feedback, even critical feedback, be clear about your high standards, but also make sure they know you believe they can reach those standards. And remember those self-affirmation exercises we talked about. Having students do those can be a game changer. Boost their self-worth, make them less vulnerable to stereotype threat.
So what about when someone's already feeling stereotype threat? How can they cope?
Instead of trying to bury those negative emotions, help them reframe the situation. Let them know it's okay to feel stressed, but help them see that stress as coming from the task itself, not from them not being good enough. And believe it or not, humor can be a good coping tool for some people. And this is biggable. Teach them about stereotype threat. Explain what it is, how it works, how it can affect them. Just knowing that those anxious feelings might be from stereotype threat, not their actual ability, that can be empowering. And studies show it can help them do better.
This has been a seriously eye-opening deep dive. Stereotype threat, it's not just some test day worry, it's a huge barrier that can hold so many people back from learning and reaching their full potential.
I agree. And the research we've explored, it gives us a solid understanding of how this all works. But it also shows us that things can change. If we understand these often hidden but super powerful psychological forces, and if we use those evidence-based strategies in our schools and learning environments, we can create a more level playing field for everyone, a place where everyone can thrive.
So to all our listeners out there, as you're learning and working, think about those sneaky ways stereotypes might be at play. You might not even realize it, but they could be affecting how you learn and perform. And think about those strategies we talked about, not emphasizing those identities that are under threat, focusing on how abilities can grow, encouraging self-affirmation. We can all use those to unlock more potential in ourselves and in others. What seems like a small change could make a huge difference. That's something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.